Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Becky Hoag, and I welcome you to Books Between Bites, and it's wonderful to see this big crowd today. And I know that you are looking forward to our speaker, and I just wanted to quick say at the back table on the left, my left, is a clipboard if you'd like to be on my email list to get monthly emails about the upcoming programs. Just sign up, make sure I can read your email, and I'll get it right. And then I just once a month I'll be sending you a notice. We have one more program in May, The Anxious Generation with Kathy Hubbard and Linda Sullivan. And then we will be planning, Kristen Schultz at the back, and I plan the upcoming season for, it's hard to believe, 25, 26, our 37th season, really about our 38th, but COVID shut us down for a while. So we thank you very much for coming. Sign up if you'd like, if you're not already on my email list. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. And this is his fourth visit to Books Between Bites. And how many of you already know Dan? Lots of.
I don't owe you money, do I? Okay.
Some of you know, because he's president of the Batavia Historical Society, which I think my father was at one point. And they share the love of Lincoln, if you knew my father. Did anyone here go in my father's Lincoln seminar? Yes, a few times. So Lincoln's been in my life, and it has been in Dan's too. So Dan Hoefler is a retired history teacher. He said in York, Oswego. And he was Citizen of the Year this past year.
A couple years ago.
So we're honored to have him back. He told me about this book and the timeliness of it, and he will explain that all to you. So without further ado, Dan Hoefler.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, here we are. And I'm just going to do a quick thing here on a personal note. My wife has Parkinson's, and she was recently injured in a fall. And I have my phone on in case I get a phone call and have to take that. So if I dash out real quick, I'll dash back in quickly as well, because we've been going back and forth over the direction that we're going to take with her medical care. 160 years, that's why we're here. Today's April 10th. April 10th, 1865, 160 years ago. What had just happened the day before? Lee had surrendered at Appomattox to Grant. Lee was dressed, as you know, in his full uniform regalia. Distinguished gentleman that he was. I'm not going to debate whether he was a hero or a traitor, great general or not a great general. That's a different conversation altogether. But it's one that's worth having at some point, because there's a lot more to admire about Robert E. Lee than I think we've been giving him credit for recently. Grant walks in. He's in his dirty day uniform, mud on his boots, just walks in, and there he stands. The two of them, and the war ends. And Grant lets Lee up easy, because that's what Lincoln had wanted. He wanted the South to be let up. Make the terms generous is what Lincoln had said to Grant not too many days before that, when he was visiting down in Petersburg. So on April 9th, this happens. By the way, who was there are two important gentlemen in that room besides Lee and Grant that witnessed this event. Anybody have any thoughts as to who those people might be?
Sure.
Nope.
No.
No, he was still down in the South. He was headed up from, taking care of business down there in Atlanta, Savannah, because there was still a Southern Army in the field in North Carolina, and there was still a Southern Army, the Army of the Cumberland, that was still active in Tennessee, and there was still an army out in Texas under Kirby in the Southern Forces. No, but it was somebody very close to Abraham Lincoln.
Robert Todd.
Robert Todd was there. You've got the book. There you go. Thank you for reading that. Robert Todd Lincoln was there. He was one of the adjutants that served on the staff with Grant, so he was there. And the other important person that was there, since we've been focusing in on repatriation of their lands recently in this country, passing the act returning artifacts to our Native Americans.
Custer.
No, it wasn't Custer. No, it wasn't. They left them there, out there on the Little Bighorn. By the way, if you ever go, they're changing that whole history and interpretation as well. What you need to focus in on that the gentleman who wrote the terms and wrote it out was an American Indian officer on Grant's staff. That's one of the unique things about the study of Lincoln. And as my good friend Dan here knows, there are lots of books about Lincoln. Probably more books on Lincoln than any other figure in American history. More books on whether there was a conspiracy or not concerning the South and the Confederacy. Dan, what was the name of your book again? It was Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln and the Structure of Reason.
And the Structure of Reason. If you haven't had a chance to read, it's based on Euclides. Did I say that right?
Euclid.
Euclid, yeah, and the whole geometry. Lincoln was a big fan, as you may know. So then on April 10th, Lincoln is in the White House. He's reflecting on what the next few days are going to bring. He, at that point, had made the decision to go to Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th with Mary Todd Lincoln. Eventually, an invitation would be sent out for Lincoln to go. They didn't decide until that day. And of course, you know, Grant and Mrs. Grant decided not to go because she did not like Mrs. Lincoln particularly. Mary Todd was an interesting individual, as many of you know and have read about. So there they are. April 14th comes about. But let's talk about, I'll move on to the next page here, keeping my notes straight. Let's talk about James Swanson, the author of this particular book. You can see him, and you're going to see a lot more of him in the next week, if not already this weekend, because of the 160th anniversary of the ending of the Civil War and the assassination of Lincoln. He's on C-SPAN a lot, and C-SPAN History, and American History Book TV. So you can watch these gentlemen talk about their books, and it's very, very interesting. And they keep it short. You know, they never go more than an hour when they bring these authors and historians in to talk about their particular subject. I like this guy. He's easy to listen to. He's written several books. He has a degree from the University of Chicago, UCLA. He's held a number of positions in the government and the State Department, Department of Justice. You can see the different books. And there's the interesting thing about it. Why did James Swanson get interested in Lincoln in the first place? He was born on Lincoln's birthday. I mean, there's just always these connections that people make, you know, as to why they get interested in that. The first book that I read, and I see Miss Nan Phillips out here, she was an educator, and I see Miss Marge Brown, an educator. You know, the love that we have for people and events, things that we learn to like in our life is, I loved history, right? And one of the first books I ever read through and through was a book about Lincoln in Washington. You know, back when we celebrated their birthdays on separate, which, by the way, brings me to another subject. The kids in school deserve to have those 2 days off instead of one in February, don't you think? I got those 2 days off. Of course, I grew up in the Chicago public schools, so we didn't go to school until after Labor Day. We didn't get out until after Flag Day. And by the way, Flag Day celebration is coming up, and of course, you know the history of that. So listen, look for the programs concerning Flag Day. So again, you know, he's just one of a series of gentlemen. The other well-known author, if you will, is Harold Holzer. How many of you have seen or listened or bought one of Harold's books? Yeah, he really is one of the preeminent Lincoln Scholars. Every year he helps organize the Lincoln Forum, which is held at Gettysburg in November when Lincoln spoke there. I've always wanted to go. Mrs. Hoefler says, how many times do you have to go to Gettysburg? I'm not going to Gettysburg in November. I said, well, can I go? No, you can't go. You don't get to go without me. And, you know, just one more thought before we move on. I see Sue Peterson out here. Years ago, just as I was getting ready to retire from being an educator 15 years ago, her husband Bob asked me to talk about my growing Lincoln artifacts, which I brought many today, and I'll explain some of them, to speak to the Batavia Historical Society. At that time, he called me a real Lincoln scholar, so you let Bob know that I'm continuing to talk about Lincoln and to thank him for being a friend and mentor. Really, really is. So moving on, we go down. Well, you know the players. Here they are, John Wilkes Booth, the actor. I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Booth family and the actors, but they were one of the preeminent families in the American stage, in theater. This was the entertainment of that particular day. There was no internet, there was no television. We probably were better off without both of those in some ways, but that's another conversation to have sometime. But that's Booth. Handsome man, you know, and there are lots of stories of the ladies that he was involved with over his life, never married. And then, of course, the president. This is the last photo that was taken just a couple of days before he went to Ford's Theater. He went down from the White House, down the street on Pennsylvania Boulevard. I think it was on K Street. You know, you ever been to Washington? K Street, L Street, this circle, that circle. It's a hard city to get around sometimes because the way it was laid out was on the spherical format. He goes and he sits for Alexander Gardner. And that's the last photo that you see of Lincoln. Where is that photo today? The print and the plate is at the Library of Congress, and the plate got broken. So sometimes you may see this photograph, more of a headshot of Lincoln that was also taken. So it's there, but the glass plate was broken. A few years ago, Daniel Weinberg, who's the president and CEO of the Abraham Lincoln bookstore in Chicago, Illinois, he's pricey. He put out he had gotten the plate from Gardner. How he ever got this plate, I don't know how people collect things and where they get stuff. A couple of years ago, I did a Pachaw for George, and when that program was going, and it was about collecting artifacts. It was called Washington's Hair, and how people collect a little bit of this, a little bit of that person. And that happened, of course, with Lincoln as well. But he got a hold of the plate, and using the same photographic process to make a print, using the same paper, he made so many prints. And he used it to sell to people who wanted a replica of the Alexander Gardner print of Lincoln right before he spoke at Gettysburg. And it's the only full facial photograph ever taken of Lincoln where he's looking directly into the camera. Every other photo that you see of Lincoln is not a direct eye for eye at the camera. And Lincoln at that time was the most photographed up until, you know, we get to the modern era of people that, presidents that were photographed. So let's move on to the other major player. Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. The man who said at the death of Lincoln at 7:12 on the morning of April 15th at the Peterson House, he belongs to the ages. Now there's controversy. Here's another Lincoln. Did he actually say it? Well, I'm going to err on the side of caution and say, yeah, I think he did. They were very, very close. And Lincoln called Stanton my Mars. And as you know from mythology, Mars was the god of war. Lincoln virtually turned over the operation of the Civil War except for the grand strategy. That's another conversation. So many conversations to have. How many hours do you guys have? He did everything. You know, everything was under Stanton's control. So it only made sense that when Lincoln was shot, he would take control of what was going on. Now, the other photo that you see there is Toby Menzies. The Apple TV last year did the Manhunt. It was based on Swanson's book. Again, is it accurate? Yes. In terms of the relationships, who the figures are, the dates, you know, but it spurred, again, another conversation with the American people to say what's going on with this manhunt for Lincoln, the 12 days after Lincoln is shot. And the interesting thing about it is the producers decided they weren't going to have the actor. Now, when you watch Lincoln by Spielberg, the gentleman who plays Stanton has the beard. He looks like Stanton, okay? And I can't remember the name of I think it's Bruce McGill might be his name. He's been on a number of TV series. He looks nothing like Stanton. The only thing that he's recognizable by, Stanton also wore a top hat like that as well. He looks nothing like Stanton. But what the TV series shows is relationships and how those relationships worked, and why Stanton was obsessed with finding Lincoln's killers. They were not going to get away with it. Remember, the big conversation that was being waged in Washington, D.C. at this time when Andrew Johnson becomes president, how do we rebuild the Confederacy? Now, notice I said rebuild. The Congress would say Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, as you well know, took us down a different path than the one if Lincoln had survived the assassination attempt that day on the Ford's Theater. Okay? That's where we are at this particular point. Let me see if I can belong to this. All right? All right, that's the relationship. Well, here we go to the next photograph. Again, everybody knows this one. I'm not going to go into repeating, you know, how he snuck up the stairway, drilled a hole, you know, looked at the president, you know, waited for the right moment. And the right moment was when there was a line and it was being uttered, and you old glad trap something or other on the stage, and it was supposed to get a big laugh, and that's when Booth fired the Derringer. And I have the Derringer here, not the one that's at Ford's Theater, but if you'd like to afterwards, this is an exact replica of the Derringer that Booth used to assassinate the president. The actual Derringer is on display at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Great place to go and visit, right down from the White House. It's been really cleaned up. First time I went there, all around it were art bookstores, adult type of stuff, clubs for men. You don't see that anymore. There's a Hard Rock Cafe right there, but this is the actual weapon. Not the actual weapon, but the actual replica of the weapon. Not very big, is it? No, it's real tiny. This is what changed history. This artifact right here changed history. It was a cap and ball system, put a cap on it, and fire. And that was it. And Lincoln was hit. Now, we know that in the booth with him is Major Rathbone and Mrs. Rathbone. They were watching the play. Booth assassinates the president. We know he jumps over. His foot gets caught on the drape. He breaks his ankle or tibia at that particular point in time. And off he goes at that point. So Booth will be on the run. They move Lincoln over to Peterson House. Now what's interesting is when Lincoln is shot, they call for a doctor, and the doctor goes up. And the doctor really gives his testimony when the conspirators are put on trial. He talks about the president's wound. And there were over 300 witnesses to this event that takes place after Booth is killed in the Garrett farmhouse, not the Garrett farmhouse, the Garrett farmhouse, 12 days after Lincoln is assassinated. The doctor that first gets there says, I cannot find a wound. There was no visible bleeding. Remember, it's a mini ball. It's not very big. So he could not find it. So he's reaching around Lincoln's head, and he finds a little clotted mess right behind his ear. And he goes, I think this is where it is. And he's looking, and he sticks his little finger into the gunshot wound. And he unplugs the blood. And then he knows this is where the president had been shot. The ball traveled through Lincoln's brain and lodged behind his eye. How do we know that? Well, when they got him over to Peterson House, the doctors there, they used a probe. They used a probe. You've seen movies of these doctors in the Civil War. They have a probe and they're looking for the bullet. Well, this is how they know they had it, and it was removed at that point. Where is the bullet? It's at the Bethesda Museum, along with the other artifacts that were used. Now, what's interesting about this photograph, the chair that Lincoln is in, the rocker, that's at Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in Detroit. That's where that's located. So if you ever want to go and see the chair that Lincoln was in, the one that they have at Ford's Theater is a replica of the chair that Lincoln was in. The actual chair is at Ford's Theater. The carriage that transported Lincoln that night to the theater with Mrs. Lincoln, that's in Indiana. It's at a museum for carriages, so if you ever want to get over to Indiana, you can see it there. The bed that Lincoln died on is at the Chicago History Museum. The dress that Mary Todd Lincoln wore with the bloodstains as she cradled her husband's head is at the Chicago History Museum. Laura Keene, who was the actress who also went up and cradled Lincoln's head as well, she kept her dress. And what she did with it, she would go around and give talks around the country about the assassination, what happened, and she had cut off sections of her dress and she sold these souvenirs because they were souvenir hunters. And maybe some of you talking about souvenirs of Lincoln, the next day when he died and the Petersons had everybody out, they had a photograph taken, and many of you may have seen this photograph of the deathbed of Lincoln. Souvenir hunters came in, descended on the Peterson house. They cut up sections of the bedding. They took the pillow. They actually have now at the Smithsonian, or is it the Library of Congress? I've talked to a historian there. They have the bloodstained pillow. They were able to finally recover it of Lincoln. It's not been on display for I can't remember how many years. I think the last time may have been over 100 years ago when that was on display. So there's a lot of artifacts that are right there. So that's that. Oh, by the way, his top hat that he wore that night at Ford's Theater, his great cloak, is at Ford's Theater also. So there are a lot of people with a lot of artifacts. In fact, my son lives 3 doors down from the mayor of Skokie. And Mayor Schilke and I have had conversations because I happen to know this mayor of Skokie. He's also someone that has a great admiration for the president, has his own collection. So from time to time when I see him out, when I go to visit my kid, we talk about, what you get now recently? So we have this interesting conversation. In fact, Laura, I think the mayor said he's coming out one of these days to visit the Batavia site. So that's going to be interesting to be able to join him. So let's move on. So now, booths on the run. It's 10:15. There's the Surratt Tavern owned by Mary Stewart. That's his destination. There's so many details, we just can't get bogged down. Otherwise, you'll be here until Law and Order comes on tonight at 7. He's on the escape. 10:15, he leaves. He escapes Washington, 14 miles. You know, when it's portrayed on TV and other stuff, it's like, oh, he just ran outside of town. Well, he crosses the Potomac. He's on his way to the Surratt Tavern. And this is where he has hidden or has a Spencer carbine. He has other weapons. He's making his escape. And what's interesting is, as you can see here, Booth and David Harold, who he goes with, as we know, he had injured his leg. He tells the innkeeper, his name was Lloyd, and he says, you want to know what happened? Booth can't help himself. He's an actor. Have you heard the news? They've killed the president. Like, okay, but he wanted some automatically to be given credit for killing the president of the United States. The first time in our nation's history that that had ever done. So he gets the guns, he loads up on some whiskey to fortify himself. He had to have been in great pain. You know, too bad, I guess, if you're a Lincoln fan, you suffer, you know. That's part of the problem. So he couldn't help himself. All right, so where next? The manhunt goes to Samuel Mudd. And here is Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, they spend a lot of time in the TV series, Manhunt, talking about what was happening at Mudd's farmhouse. Mudd is a doctor. He's also a tobacco farmer. He's also a slave owner. Okay? Booth goes to him. He doesn't necessarily, Booth, when he arrives at Mudd's, there's this controversy. Did Booth and Mudd know each other? They did. So he doesn't get to Mudd's farmhouse to get his leg splinted. He's there, it's about several hours ride. They estimate it took him about 7 hours to get there. So it's about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Now remember, he's left Washington at 10:15 with his escape. Mudd applies this splint, has one of the slaves make him a set of crutches. Booth pays him $25, Yankee cash, not Confederate cash. Money's no good. Confederate money's no good. By the way, Lincoln, when he died that day, in his pocket, he carried a $5 Confederate bill. Yeah, he carried a $5 Confederate bill. Mudd, this is where things get muddy for Mudd. Did you like that? Okay. He doesn't tell the authorities right away. You know, Mudd is a Southern sympathizer. Should I tell them? Do I really trust that Booth is telling me the truth? Is he just acting again? This is Booth. This is the confusion that we have. And should Mudd turn Booth in or see the authorities? So did they know each other? Well, eventually, when they do capture Booth, they eventually kill him in the farmhouse. The conspirators are put on trial. This is the big problem that Mudd has, and he doesn't escape from that. He's found guilty of being one of the conspirators. He's sent to Fort Jefferson. Does everybody know where Fort Jefferson is? Mr. Heimsath in the back. It's in the Dry Tortugas off Key West. And it's here that a yellow fever outbreak takes place. Mudd saves many of the men who are incarcerated there. In 1869, because of his efforts, Andrew Johnson, who is still the president at that point, what word did the president use? Expunges his, doesn't expunge his record. Pardons him, yeah. I got confused because there were so many pardons going around here in this country recently. So he's pardoned in 1869 by President Johnson. Back today, Mudd's family still petitions his ancestors for his record to be expunged. That he was not a conspirator, he was not directly related to the assassination of the president. He is still considered to be guilty in the conspiracy to assassinate the President of the United States. His record has never been expunged, okay? Life imprisonment, but again, pardoned by President Johnson. So that's Mudd. Now, here we go on, I can never see which way this direction was this. Now, while they're on the run, Booth is obsessed with his reviews. You know, I don't always believe these actors and actresses that go on TV when they're being interviewed and they ask the question, well, did you see yourself in the last film you did? Oh, I never watch myself. It's too much to be able to see what I'm doing. Well, hello, people. They're actors and actresses. Booth is obsessed with reviews while they're on the run. He tries to get newspaper accounts. He wants to know what's going on, and he's dismayed. He is absolutely dismayed. Thomas Jones, a Confederate, helps to shield him in a pine thicket. This is the gentleman who brings him the newspapers. He's crushed because he's being damned. Okay, he's in Virginia. There aren't a lot of newspapers being printed in Virginia. This is after the Civil War. Richmond has been virtually burned to the ground. The only newspapers accounts he's going to get is from Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and the surrounding area. So naturally, these hotbeds of unionism are going to be critical of Booth. They know that Booth is the guilty, well, I shouldn't say the guilty, suspected of being that. This is what Booth says. Well, I've slain a Julius Caesar. I've slain a tyrant, because that's what the Southern looked at Lincoln as. He was a tyrant. How can it be that I'm now damned and hunted and despised? After all, he's an actor. He is acting at that point. Oops, I went the wrong way. Is that right? I always read my... Now here's always an interesting question, one that Swanson talks about in his book, one that the TV series does not really address, and that is, could Booth have made a way, could he have gotten away with it if he hadn't been injured? If he'd been able to get on his horse, he would have stopped at Garrett's farm, he would not have stopped at Mudd's to get healed, to get a splint, to get crutches. He was hoping on Southern sympathizers to give him money and shelter. Booth was keenly aware that, as I mentioned earlier, there were still Southern armies in the field. There was Joe Johnston, there was Kirby in Texas, the Carolina Army was still there. They were talking about a resistance. Even though Lee had surrendered, not all of the Confederate armies in the field had actually taken. It's not until later in the year that they finally laid down their swords and the Civil War. At that point, the conflict is over. Okay, at that particular bit. He may have gotten away with it. The Southern sympathizers would have done that. They'd have concealed him. They ultimately think, and Swanson addresses this, so what was his goal? As he does and as I do, I think his goal, because he couldn't go to Savannah, he couldn't go to Wilmington, he couldn't go down to Mobile, but he could go to Texas. He could get across the country, going west, get down to Texas, link up with Kirby's Confederate Army, and get down to Galveston. If he gets to Galveston, he gets on a steamship, he gets to France or England, and he gets away. Ultimately, I think that's where Booth is headed, and Harold. Okay? I think ultimately this is the goal, is to get to England at that particular point in time. Gets deeper in the Confederacy. Okay, here we go. Again, here we go. Now, here's Stanton again, the Czar, the Mars. The chase was led by Secretary of War Stanton. As you can see, according to Swanson, if there was anybody who could have done this with the kind of zeal, with the kind of motivation, it was Stanton. Where does he rank? Well, a lot of historians, and Swanson addresses this, thinks that Stanton, because he had won the Civil War, he had done the strategy, he had mobilized the entire nation to win this war. It was clearly Stanton who was going to be able to lead this search for Booth. He was not going to get away with the assassination of the president. This is Edwin M. Stanton, okay? He investigates the murder. He sends detectives in the field. The TV show does a pretty good job. He sends out detectives to find out who are the other conspirators, what's going on. begin to put together a timeline. You ever watch the cop shows these days? Who doesn't? There's all sorts of them. They always put up this whiteboard. On this whiteboard, they put pictures, they draw arrows, and here's the timeline, and everybody's figuring out, okay, we rule this guy. Well, that's kind of what they were doing. That's kind of what they were doing. And Stanton had detectives doing this. And as I mentioned here, there were still people in the field. But probably the thing that, demonstrated Stanton's love for Lincoln more than anything else was he put together the funeral procession. This is how we're going to honor the President of the United States. He's going to lie in state in the White House, first of all. Believe it or not, there is a picture of Lincoln in his coffin. You can go online, you can see it. I didn't choose to put that together again, we'd be here forever. You can see that photograph of him. Lincoln was embalmed so that he could endure the almost 2-week travel from Washington, D.C. across the country back to Springfield, Illinois, where he eventually was going to be put into a temporary coffin until a more permanent one is built and constructed for the president. Again, that's a whole other story about Lincoln's body trying to be stolen a few years later, and the Pinkerton Guards finding out about it, and a conspiracy out of Chicago in a bar. I mean, there's so much stuff. I mean, you just can't keep it all straight sometimes. Stanton has to hunt down John Wilkes Booth. He's got to put the conspirators on trial. We got to get a conviction. Then once we get a conviction, what are we going to do with them? But above all, Stanton wants a national tribute. And I was very fortunate to go to a Civil War show. And here's one of the artifacts that I have. It's a cutting. Yes, I know it's a cutting. I'm bad. But the person who cut this was selling it. Had one of the buntings, the drapes that are that you can see along here. This is from the inside, where Lincoln's casket was in the funeral train as it moved from Washington, D.C. to Chicago and then on to Springfield, Illinois. This is an actual cutting from that bunting that was in Lincoln's funeral car. From there. Okay, so Stanton, nobody else could do it. Why not then, we move on to the next question, and that is, why not William Seward? See this photograph here? I have I have one of the copies of Brady's photograph of William Seward, the Secretary of State. Remember Seward's Folly? He bought Alaska? What a deal. Oh man, what a deal. Kind of like Jefferson in Louisiana. Few decades before that. Can anybody tell me why, when you look at that photograph, why he's faced that direction and why he's not doing a full facial photograph? What?
It was his best side.
No.
It was part of the assassination conspiracy.
Yeah, well, you're on the right track. When was it Lewis Powell? It wasn't Lewis Powell. It was I'm drawing a blank.
Powell.
Yeah, it was Powell that had gone to kill Seward, to take down the whole structure of the federal government. He slashes. See, Seward had fallen. He was in a carriage accident, and he was severely injured. He was in a neck break. He was immobilized. So when Powell went up, he was slashing. He was using a knife. Seward was slashed across his face, and he had this huge scar. So that's why the rest of his life, you only see Seward facing the camera. Well, he's not really facing the camera, but just a side view. Okay? Seward was not equipped. He could not have done the investigating. He could not have sent the men out looking for Lincoln. He could not have put together the national processional. He could not have put the funeral together. He was injured. He was bedridden. He could not get up. Now, you read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, at Spielberg. They were rivals. There's no question about it, but they learned to respect each other, Lincoln and Seward. It is Seward who is hoping to bring the war to a conclusion and save, because it was Lincoln's desire, to save some of the Confederacy, to let them off easy. and they do negotiate, and they're on a steamboat on the Potomac right before the surrender of Lee to Grant to try and get the Civil War resolved. Seward is busy with that. Now, did I leave anything else? Seward. Yeah, he couldn't have done it. So then the next person. Well, isn't there somebody else that could have led this? Maybe somebody else that was in charge? How about Andrew Johnson, the vice president during this manhunt? Oh, well, you talk about. What can we say? He is considered to be one of the 3 worst presidents of the United States ever. You know, again, you know the stories. Was he drunk the day of the 1865 inauguration in March? Yeah. Yes, he was drunk. Did he have a hotel room where he would retire to down the street from the White House? Was he drunk the night Lincoln was shot? Yes. Was Johnson capable of organizing the government? No. It's Stanton. The only thing, and I know everybody in this room recognizes what happened when Ronald Reagan was shot in Washington, coming out of the Washington Hilton after giving a speech to the union. I can't remember the name of the union. And there's some confusion, and George H.W. Bush is the vice president. Who's the one guy that gets up and says, when the press is getting together, who's in charge? Because nobody had heard from the vice president. Who gets up?
Al Haig.
Al Haig does. And he said, they asked him, who's, he says, I'm in charge. Okay. All right, well, that didn't happen here because fortunately, Johnson's incapable of doing everything that needed to be done, as I've said, that Stanton is going to do. Okay? Climbs up the steps, booth, messenger was sent. George Azeroth was to shoot the vice president, but he changed his mind and ran away and never did kill the vice president. So it does fall to Stanton. Maybe the only other person in the government at that time that could have done the whole organizing might have been Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy. Lincoln and Welles really liked and appreciated each other a great deal. Where's Booth? He's headed south. There's a $100,000 reward. They know there are a couple of conspirators on the run. So Booth they're offering $50,000 for the capture of Booth, $25,000 for the other 2 conspirators. And maybe many of you have seen the poster. I have a copy of the poster at home, but I decided not to bring it today. Just a few other things. And again, it's a replica. It's not an actual one. You know, some of those things go for $50,000, $60,000, as much as the reward. I mean, I did okay with my investments, but lately, hoo-wee. So they cross the bridge over the Potomac. How does it come to an end? Well, it all comes to an end when the Union sends the 16th New York Cavalry. They hear that Booth is in the area. Almost 12 days have now passed. They're closing in on him. They encounter some Confederate soldiers who are returning home from the war. One of them admits that they saw a man who could have been John Wilkes Booth. We'll never know if he knew it was actually Booth. But again, Booth was a famous actor, so it's entirely possible that Booth was recognized while they're searching for him. They take one man, they capture, they go to Bowling Green, where the other men say they saw who Booth was. They rouse him from their bed, and they say, we know you've seen Booth, we're going to kill you, these are the soldiers. And he says, well, you just rode past him. He's at Garrett's farm where I left him. He's right there now as far as I know. So the 16th New York Cavalry turns around, and they head to Garrett's farm. Now, do I have a picture of Garrett's farm here? Oh, here we go. The next slide. Here's one of the few known pictures of Garrett's farm. This is when it's in great, it's falling down. You know, it's in terrible shape. It eventually falls. It's removed. There's nothing there anymore. It's just a field. The barn is gone. There's no barn where Booth hid out. All there is a sign, and there's a couple of them, that point you to Garrett's farm, where the chase finally eventually ends. So the chase ends. The family sends Booth because they're afraid he's there to steal things. They put him in to the barn. The cavalry shows up. They know Booth is in the farm. They try to talk to him. They try to convince him to come out. He refuses. Harold does come out. Booth keeps himself in the barn. And this is again where one of the controversies is. This is a tobacco drying barn, so there's slats so that air can get through, so the tobacco could dry. And then they could put it in the kiln, and then eventually turn it into the tobacco that we recognize in our cigarettes and cigars and stuff like that. They're suspicious of him. They light the barn on fire, and then there's a gunshot that goes off. And this is where the chase ends. He decides he's not going to be taken alive. Booth does not want to be hanged. He has said that to Harold. I'm not going to get hanged. Okay? He can't get out. They surround him. So for a couple hours, he engages with the soldiers in kind of what they would describe as a Shakespearean dialogue, because he was a great Shakespearean actor. This is Booth again, the actor, up until the end. He says, I'll fight you to the bitter end. He knows it's over. He doesn't want to be taken. And why doesn't he want to be? He saw the gruesome way that John Brown had been hung in his raid in 1858 in Richmond. He did not want that. He was not going to be hanged. And this is what Booth ultimately decides. He's not going to get away. Harold begs to escape. They let him out. So they, rather than rush the barn, they engage in a parley. I'll fight you one by one. One more stain on the old banner talking about the flag of the Confederacy. And then Booth is killed. It's Sergeant Boston Corbett who fires the round. Booth is paralyzed. They bring him out. They put him on the porch at Garrett's farm. And this is where Booth, he's paralyzed. There's no hope for him at this point medically. There's no one there to medically save him either. Not that you think that the Union soldiers would have. They had killed their commander-in-chief. They had killed the President of the United States. They're not going to let him up. They're not going to let him up. So Booth dies. This is an illustration of the autopsy. Booth's body is taken on board a steamship, a warship on the Potomac, and this is where the autopsy is done to determine what Booth actually had died from. And of course, it's the gunshot wound that had paralyzed him. And then he tells his mother, tell my mother I die for my country. And then Booth says something that again is legend. My hands, my hands. And he looks at his hands, and then he says, useless. Useless, like it had all been for naught. All the conniving, all the putting together the conspiracy, putting together the attempt to assassinate the president. So his hands are useless. After all of this, and the final end of his Shakespearean tragedy, they're useless. But that's not where the story ends. Mary Surratt, is she an agent? Does she know what's going on? More likely than not. She is represented during the trial in Washington, D.C. The fort where the trial took place is no longer there. It's been torn down. When the four of the conspirators are hung, they're buried in the fort, and then later on they're taken out and reburied when the fort is demolished. There's really a lot of reason to believe there was a much larger conspiracy with federal agents. The Confederate Secret Service, yes, there was a Confederate Secret Service. Anything was possible. In fact, one of the interesting things is, even to her dying day, Mary Lincoln still believed that Andrew Johnson was part of the plot to assassinate the President of the United States. She believed that. Now, we can go over to Bellevue Place, and we can go ask her. No, she's not there anymore. But go visit sometime. There's a great historical plaque out there.
Why? Did she not like him? Why?
No,
Wow.
no, she did not care for him. She did not. Mary Lincoln was one of those ladies that adored her husband. And anybody that crossed Lincoln, in her mind, made her an enemy. Johnson made her an enemy. That's the only thing that people, and you can go back, you can read all the books that are written about, she had lots of enemies. She made enemies of the ladies in Washington. She made enemies within her own family. I mean, she just was not somebody that was beloved, at that particular point in time. So now we start to come to the end. So a military tribunal takes place. 4 of the 8 conspirators are convicted of murdering the president. There's a lot of speculation as to why it was a military tribunal, and Stanton said it's not going to be a trial where there's a judge and a jury, where they have lots of testimony. It's not going to happen. We're going to parade our witnesses, they're going to be found guilty, and they're going to be hung. This was going to be the end. It was almost preordained that this is the way it was going to go. They were not going to get a civil trial. It was going to be a military tribunal. Why? The President of the United States is also the Commander-in-Chief. That's how he justifies. That's how he justifies the military tribunal. So here we go. These are the 4 conspirators that are suspected. George Azaroth, Lewis Powell, Payne, and of course Mary Surratt, the only woman executed by the United States of America. Hoods were placed on their heads, and one by one. They didn't drop them all at the same time. They went one by one by one by one. It was gruesome. People who were witnesses there talk about it and said it was absolutely gruesome. Watching people. So maybe Booth was right. Maybe he was better off being shot and killed in that respect. 6 weeks it took for the trial to take place. Over 340 witnesses talking about souvenirs and mementos. You can go to Washington, D.C. The ropes that were used were cut up into sections about this long, 6 inches long. There's some still in Washington, D.C. in a couple of museums. There's several in private hands of the rope. The 4 mass hoods that were put on the conspirators are still in the possession of the government. Admission tickets, you had to have an admission ticket to get into the trial. Those still exist. A lot of people have those. And here's the interesting thing. They actually still have in the possession, it's either in the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress, they still have the key to Mary Surratt's cell. Not Mary, but Mary Surratt's cell. They still have the key. A couple artifacts that I'd like to show you. This is Lincoln's hand. This is from the original cast. So you're welcome to hold it, pick it up, say hello. Hi, Mr. President, how you doing? This is a broomstick. The day that the cast was made, he had been greeting people and his hand was swollen. So in order to keep his hand steady, they cut off a piece of a broomstick and he held on to that while the cast was made. This is a Currier and Ives. Again, Currier and Ives made a bundle because this is how the American people were shown how the president died, the moment of his death. Here you have Mary Lincoln was not in the room. There were no other women in the room. All the players back here, Robert Todd crying. It's really not good. I mean, is it accurate? Yeah, to some extent. You really can't tell because he was on an angle because the bed was too short and he was too long. But this is what the American people came to believe. You know, the other great picture, you mentioned Custer earlier, Dan. Budweiser, everybody heard of Budweiser? I may have had one or two. For years and years, Budweiser, when they owned a bar or provided beer, Pete knows this, above and back of the bar where there used to be mirrors, there was a full-length mirror, and it was a picture of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Custer is standing there firing his weapon with the Indians all around him. That's how people came to imagine Little Bighorn. And then Errol Flynn came along, It's really bad history. That's all I can tell you. That night that Lincoln went to the to Ford's Theater, he always carried a pocket knife. Why did he carry a pocket knife? Well, he did it to cut, and he used to whittle. This is the actual, not actual again, it's a replica of the actual knife that Lincoln carried in his pocket, made by the same company. They're still in existence today. They're still in existence today. You can go to their website and you can buy them. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to pay the money, because it's something that people like and they want to have a piece of Lincoln. And then, Lincoln came home to Springfield after the Lincoln family sold the home. The Edwards family had possession of it. This is a photograph that was taken by the caretaker. This is what Lincoln's home would have looked like. It was untouched. The only thing that when you look at this, I found this in a shop for $5. One of the cheapest Lincoln things I ever got. There's a canopy over the front door. There's no canopy in Lincoln's day. They had put that up because visitors had come and they were complaining that if they stood outside to go in to the house, because the house was open, you can see this. Now, I've talked to the historian in the Lincoln Museum, and I've sent him a copy of this, and I said, what do you think this might be worth, and does the museum want it, and can I get credit for it? And he goes, oh, yeah, okay, I'll keep it then. Questions? And thank you for listening to me today. I hope I was entertaining, and I hope you got something out of it. We have just a couple minutes till 1 o'clock, or after. You're welcome. You're free to come up, take a look of the possessions that I have. Leave them there. If you would, any other questions that I might be able to help you with. I want to thank Becky and again her family, who have been longtime Batavians, who have promoted education and learning in this community. I see one of our library trustees, Kathy Hubbard, here, again, an educator. Again, so important, education, with educational leaders that we have in this room here with us today. Any other questions? Mr. Sheets, if you would.
Yes, this book also has a children's version, if I'm not mistaken, so you have children or grandchildren that are younger that they might be interested in, like the version that was designed for a younger audience.
Yeah.
Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, I believe that's correct, yeah. I've not written it, but it probably would have been easier for me to read.
You're a historian, historians in the room. Andrew Johnson, he seems like a duke. Was he just put in place because he would get votes if
Yes.
compromise?
Yes, because he was on the border state of Tennessee.
That was it.
That was it. He was to balance that out, because by the time the election took place in 1864, Lincoln was worried that summer that he wasn't going to win again. But when Sherman takes Atlanta, when things begin to change dramatically in the Western Theater campaign, Grant's got Lee bottled up around Petersburg at that point. The war is taking a turn. And then the people that really put the election over for Lincoln was the absentee votes of the Union Army. They voted in the field overwhelmingly to support their president and commander-in-chief. That's what put them over the top. But they figured after the war was over and they would go to rebuild the South, they would need somebody who'd been in the Senate, who knew the players in the Senate and in the Congress to help them rebuild the South. But again, Johnson was an devout Southern. He let them off easy, the Southern sympathizers. One of the reasons Reconstruction took the bad turn that it did was he did nothing. He did nothing to see that the country would rebuild. Yes, sir.
This isn't really a question, but just one thing that I've always kind of been interested about in the assassination is how relatively easy it seemed to be to assassinate the president 160 years ago. And presidents now have an entourage of people in Secret Service and all these protections around them. And it appeared like the most important person in the country had virtually no protection.
Well, there's a lot of debate about Lincoln. You know, right from the time he's elected, Pinkerton comes in, Mr. President, as you go to Washington, we need to get you in earlier. The train's got to be, the Pinkerton people. There was no Secret Service. There were military escorts. Lincoln received, from the time that the war ended to the day of his assassination, he received in the White House over 100 death threats that he was going to be killed, that they wanted him killed. That's a known fact, over 100. I don't know what to say, it's hard to say. I mean, heck, presidents still get shot, or potential presidents still get plots against them. It's kind of hard to do. If somebody's got the will, I guess,
And I had heard something about the guy who was actually supposed to be his bodyguard that night.
He was
actually
in the bar,
He was drinking.
fortifying himself. Yeah, they know that for certain. Okay. Well, thank you all. Again, thank Becky, thank the library.